Buxton from Melbourne, who is the other guest speaker tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge that Councillor Sam McIntosh is here and many Ballaarat Mechanics Institute members. The overall theme for the four talks is Ballaarat Unmasked, Getting to Know Your City. So the format for tonight, each speaker will have up to 20 minutes to give their views, and followed by the two speakers, we'll have a question and answer session. Brief question, we'll have to, because of the technology, we'll have to get people to come up and give their question as the way that we can get it recorded. So we now introduce Councillor Daniel Maloney. He's 5 years, or 5th year as being a councillor of the City of Ballaarat, our Mayor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Phil. It's great to be here. I'm so proud of the BMI to now be, as you say, in the 20th year. It's great that we're also streaming online, so anyone who's watching, I guess, via YouTube or Zoom, hopefully I'm not on mute. Hopefully you can hear us fine and we're past the joys of 2020 in the online world. Now I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered today. This is Wadawurrung land, and I recognise their wonderful connection to the land and the waterways, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that love and respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, of course, and also my councillor colleague Samantha McIntosh too. So Sam, great to see you here, and so many wonderful people of Ballarat who shape our city in so many ways. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of an insight tonight in terms of where we're heading a little bit as a council. And look, we as a council, of course, know that Ballarat is growing at a rapid rate. I don't think I'm necessarily telling you anything new there. Gone are the days when a traffic jam was 3 cars at the traffic lights. Now you can routinely expect to see 50 plus cars, especially joining the queue during school pick-up and drop-off peak times. Infrastructure challenges faced 2 decades ago by suburban Melbourne councils are now developing in regional centres like Ballarat. And while we might indeed be a truly unique city, there's still plenty that we can learn from those who have experienced these issues long before us. So tonight I'd like to focus a bit on how we're growing as a city. Now, growth to some degree might be inevitable. We can embrace it, we can learn from other cities, exploit the benefits and do our best to mitigate the negatives and the issues. Or we can have it foisted upon us and play a little role in shaping our own futures. I think it obviously goes without saying that we intend to be active in deciding together as a city what our city should look like in 2040 and beyond. We won't just let it happen to us, we'll do our best to drive that positive influence. Now, it's projected that Ballarat may have 50,000 new residents by 2040, which means a population of over 160,000 people. So let's put that in perspective. That's about 2,500 to 3,000 new residents a year added to our city. And I guess if a bus can seat about 50 people, that's about 50 to 60 bus loads of new Ballarat residents every single year for the next 19 or 20 years. Now, we'd love to see them use buses, of course, but the reality at the moment is they'll be using cars. So as we're still a city heavily dependent upon car usage, at the moment that's probably, we estimate, an extra 1,000 cars on our road every year. And to house those extra 2,500 to 3,000 people a year, we'll need to build about 1,000 new houses every single year for those new residents and unfortunately for their cars. Now, recent days on market data shows that 10 of the top 20 regional in-demand Victorian suburbs for house sales are right here in Ballarat. Incredible statistic when you think how much in demand we are, not just amongst regional cities and suburbs, but all suburbs across the state. Now, there's been a strong average property price growth in Ballarat, up 4.8% in the September 2020 quarter to a median price now of about $440,000. But we believe we can sustainably manage this growth while still ensuring Ballarat is a fantastic, thriving and livable city. I believe that we will be judged as a council and a community more broadly on how our residents experience this growth. Will the growth be just in the new corridors to the west of our city, Alfredton, Lucas, Winter Valley, and then eventually to the north of our city, places like Mount Rowan? Will the new infrastructure be biased to just those new and emerging areas, courtesy of mandatory fees on development, while the more established older suburbs continue to age? Will our inner suburbs experience growth merely through the impost of extra traffic running around local streets to avoid traffic jams? Or will we work to do our best to ensure the benefits and the challenges of growth are as evenly distributed as possible? I believe, and I think our council fully believes, that we want suburbs such as Ballarat North, Mount Helen, Sebastopol, Ballarat East, CBD of course, and places like Wendouree, our more established suburbs, to all enjoy the same standard of living and amenities as our emerging new areas. So there imposes for us a major infrastructure challenge for a city like Ballarat. Ensuring our older established suburbs experience refreshed community facilities, roads and lighting, footpath upgrades for instance. At the same time we develop for the new suburbs to meet their new, unique and growing demand. Now, I was a journalist for an inner Melbourne suburban newspaper between 1999 and 2001, covering the rapid growth of Carlton, Fitzroy, Richmond and Brunswick. It was a fun time to be a reporter in those areas, covering the city of Yarra, and they called it the People's Republic of Moreland back then, at least anyway. So it was, I think it was a Kennett era jibe at Moreland. And these were communities that, we might like to think of them as always being busy. These are inner Melbourne areas, they've always been busy, it's always been the case. But it's something that has really, sort of emerged, particularly in that period. And while we could quite rightly say that there's probably more differences and similarities in Ballarat between those suburbs, there's still many lessons that we can nevertheless learn from them. And if we fail to learn the lessons of those that have gone before us, then we have ourselves to blame. I think it's important that we look at, especially, for instance, the transport challenges that some of those growing, or rapidly growing suburbs before us have experienced. We need to look at those, the transport, how they've responded over the past couple of decades, and it gives us a glimpse into what we need to do now. Do we want Ballarat's inner suburbs to be clogged with 20,000 more cars in 20 years' time, if we're growing at around about 1,000 cars a year? What do we want to learn from the planning of places like the city of Yarra and the People's Republic of Moreland, where they led the way in a Victorian context on cycling, walking and public transport infrastructure in the early part of this century? It's incredible, I think, that cycling infrastructure here is still a really hot topic. Watch the social media critics jump for their phones when you talk about a new bike path. That's not Ballarat, they retort. No one uses bike paths, we all drive here. Well, sentiments are changing, and that will continue to be the case as those 1,000-odd more cars get added to our streets every year. And not everyone will want to drive, especially as our roads start to become more congested. And in 2040, we may well be grateful that right now, in 2021 and the years leading up to now, that we've been active in creating a new cycling path on our network every year. However, our experience of growth, of course, is if our experience of extra growth is merely extra traffic time in the years to come, then we will be judged to have failed. Growth can also bring many positive benefits that must be fully exploited to the benefit of our residents. Greater access to higher paying and more skilled jobs, greater educational opportunities for a smarter city, more sporting and community facilities that smaller cities simply don't have the capital to afford, and access to a greater range of, hopefully, sustainable houses. My own personal case, I've recently bought a new house and in one of the emerging growth western suburbs of Ballaarat. And while I've found that it does, even in the few months that I've had that place, is now taking a few minutes extra longer to commute versus the place that I previously had in Lake Gardens, it now means that not only do I have my very own affordable new house, and 5 minutes from great schools, terrific shopping centre and wonderful facilities, for me that far outweighs the traffic inconveniences. So this is really a balance. And I'm watching, for instance, in my community, a new part of Alfredton grow and the interactions being formed. It's the birth of an emerging suburb that hasn't yet formed its own traditions and subculture. It's exciting. I'm watching the new trees grow from being knee-high to starting to get towards shoulder-high, and with that, the population taking off. I see a new couple of houses every week completed around me, and I'm looking forward to being a part of that area's future. I'd now like to talk a little bit about business and some of our observations of growth in that area, as improved jobs and services must surely be one of the key benefits that come our way from growth. Now, we can't ignore both the positive and negative impacts of COVID-19 that has had on our city and its future growth. Ballaarat's construction industry is thriving and will be a major key to our economic recovery, with a steady ongoing construction work pipeline, largely due to the federal government's stimulus policies, particularly the Home Builder Grant. Now, we're also fast-tracking the new northern and western growth zones to ensure we have land that we need for the housing boom that we're currently experiencing, and we're currently forecast to be out of developable greenfield land on our current plans by 2024-25, so the next few years with new areas. Of course, we'll need to genuinely encourage infill development, and I'm happy to take some questions about that later on. And I'm talking about genuine infill development in our central area, encouraging people to live in the places where they work, not just about going out to the outer suburbs, creating future traffic jams. Our residential planning permits peaked in September last year with a 4-year high of 155 applications. The previous highest amount was 129 in May 2018. So this is interesting, just as we're sort of coming out of the second lockdown last year. Our capped revenue from general rates this year will also be a fairly substantial amount of just short of $110 million. But also keep in mind that while that is considerable, that money's ploughed back into more than 80 services we provide to the community, along with infrastructure needed to accommodate rapid growth, everything from roads, playgrounds, drains, footpaths, and other infrastructure. Manufacturing is one of our biggest industries still in Ballarat, contrary to popular opinion. It's very much not dead, it's thriving. And it felt very little impact from COVID-19, mainly due to government incentives and a lack of competition from imports. However, clearly tourism numbers have been hard hit. Visitor numbers were down almost 50%. It's incredible in the year ending September. So they were down from about 3.4 million visitors in September 2019 to about 1.9 million the same time September last year. A big drop of about 1.8 million visitors per annum. Incredible. Though there has been some, you will notice yourselves, even just driving around, especially walking around the streets of Ballarat on a weekend in particular, there has been clearly some recovery from the domestic market, assisting our businesses with more people travelling locally and from places like Melbourne. Total tourism expenditure, though, unfortunately has gone down $619 million in September to $330 million. So over nearly $300 million drop in our tourism benefit in a year. So clearly that's a sector still hurting, while others are doing well. That one's not. The overall outlook, though, is that visitation will be lower for quite a while without international travel. I guess the bad news of last year is that we lost almost 7,000 jobs initially in Ballarat during the peak of COVID-19, although those jobs have come back online progressively with restrictions easing. And of course they rode the wave of closures, and even during the second lockdown we experienced a similar loss of jobs. However, in December and January just past, restrictions have obviously eased again, and job levels are now essentially close to back to pre-COVID levels. We still have a loss. February's unemployment rate was 5.1%, after peaking at nearly 10%. So things have improved considerably. That said, Ballarat is still at the moment tracking about 2.6% above the Victorian average, which is pity because we actually, pre-COVID, were doing better than the Victorian average. August also saw Ballarat businesses requesting assistance, peaking at 41%. About 3,700 businesses required assistance to get through COVID last year. By January, that number from 3,700 has come down to about 1,400. So still about 16% of our businesses at the start of this year required assistance. And it's obviously COVID has had a significant impact on local infrastructure in Ballarat, local expenditure in Ballarat, my apologies, with figures rising and falling in tandem with the lockdowns. The most impacted industries, I think you probably could guess, were travel, which was down 90% or $3 million locally, dining and entertainment down 63% or $15 million, and personal services down 71% or $2.2 million. But since November, spending has again, interestingly, quickly rebounded. Spending in November has risen above 2019 levels, so prior to the pandemic. So it is a city that has, for the most part, quickly bounced back, aside from the tourism component. Business confidence was strong pre-COVID and is now now optimistically heading into this new year as well. The recent Ballarat Business Confidence Survey 2020 shows that businesses all want stakeholders to work together to ensure faster recovery and sustained growth. Confidence in a return to business in Ballarat is also reflected in parking statistics of all things. So we have interesting stats that we want to do better at making available to all of our businesses. Now we can quite accurately track parking. We know where businesses are hot and where they're not, based often by the parking movements. So for instance, in August last year, during one of the lockdowns, the number of cars or people parking in the CBD dropped to 3,000 compared to nearly 7,000 now. And we can get right down to street by street and provide that sort of level of data and detail now to the business community. Of course, it's reflecting what they're seeing in their bottom line, so we're not necessarily telling them anything new, but it is all that intel we can provide. We're also not just using our smarter parking system, but we have great access these days to aggregated banking data where we can even tell the degree to which certain sectors in certain areas are tracking as well too. So it's sort of anonymised. We don't know where you bought your socks from or anything like that, but we can see sectors in certain areas and how they're tracking. So that's how I guess we get many of those statistics. Now, I do see some great potential for Ballarat arising out of the horrors of COVID. If I said to you all 2 years ago that Melburnians will be prevented from travelling overseas and for a big period they won't even be allowed to go interstate, you'd probably think I was crazy. But that's exactly what's happened. Some 80% at times of Melburnians have never been to regional Victoria. Their perceptions are so dated. Now they've been forced to actually get out and experience regional Victoria. Perceptions have been updated. They've seen that we've got a thriving foodie and culture scene. I'm getting my wind up. So I see some great potential, especially also as people can tell that we are now, through Zoom and through living and working from home, that living in country areas like Ballaarat is far more viable. Now, I probably should start to wrap up in that case, at least anyway. So there's plenty at the moment that we are doing, and I'm happy to sort of take that in questions. I'll skip a bit of my notes here anyway to keep us on time. But there's plenty we're doing at the moment. We are midway through a council planning process. So Samantha and my colleagues at the moment are planning through our key infrastructure projects, and we're about to embark on a pretty exciting community consultation vision at the moment, involving 45 people that represent the breadth of Ballarat's demographics. They meet for the first time on Saturday week, and they start to put together a framework of what they want to see from Ballarat. So it's not just our usual lobbyists that are approaching us, but a range of different community members that will give us some good impact into how they want to see Ballarat continue to grow. Now I'm going to sort of start to wrap up, I guess, by noting at least that we had a couple of weeks ago launching our new tourism campaign, a Regional Australia Institute Chief Economist, Dr. Kim Horton, who spoke to us about his work in understanding the perceptions of people in capitals in regard to their intentions to move or otherwise to regional areas. And one of the interesting stats that stuck with us is that his data shows that 1 in 5 people are currently, if you're a Melburnian, for instance, 1 in 5 of you are thinking about moving to a regional area. Think about that, I guess, for a moment. What's Melbourne's population now? 5.5, 6 million people. A bit over 1 million of them are actually thinking about leaving Melbourne. So a place like Ballarat has so much to offer, but we need to ensure that we continue to grow sustainably, that we listen to our community, and we grow in a way that makes sure that the benefits are spread as equally as possible. So I think back to my times as a suburban journalist in inner Melbourne at the turn of the century, and I'm determined with my councillor colleagues to learn and listen from other areas, to listen to our residents. There's still so much that we can learn from the people who live here, as well as other cities that have walked this path before. And I'm excited to keep that learning going and learning about what our city wants to be in 2040. So thank you very much for the chance to speak today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I didn't know you'd been a journalist, so I've learnt that bit as well, but there are so many different issues. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Michael Buxton, a planning expert and commentator in the area of planning. He's a former Professor of Environment and Planning at the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies at RMIT University. He's the author and co-author of many articles about urban planning. Make him welcome.
It's a bit like coming up into the clouds here. Thank you for the invitation to come. It's great to see so many people here. It's obviously the future of Ballarat is obviously a big issue for the people of Ballarat. My wife and I had the chance this afternoon to walk around the central town area, central city area of Ballarat, and it is a reminder that heritage allows us, retaining our heritage allows us to literally walk into the past. And it's a reminder also of how important that is for us to understand that living is not just about the present, going out and buying and consuming and doing whatever we gain satisfaction of today, but to understand that who we are today really is very much a matter of where we came from. There's so much evidence and literature now on how important heritage is to identity, personal identity, community identity, and an understanding of the future. So it's always wonderful to come back to Ballarat. And I do agree with Daniel that the council and decision makers today are going to be, in the future, are going to be judged on what they've done today to anticipate the pressures on cities like Ballarat. And as Daniel said, Ballarat is under increasing pressure, and I do agree that the pressure that it's experiencing now is really well below what it's going to achieve in the future. I think there's going to be a big change in the way regional development pressures are experienced. Australia's always been this country of 5 major metropolitan areas, and I think people are realising that that is very unusual in the world. Most countries don't have most of their people live like that. So what should the council and other decision makers be doing to deal with growth today in order to anticipate tomorrow and be judged well in 30, 40, 50 years' time. It's interesting to look at the planning Ballarat City has done. There's a lot of strategic work that's been done. I think the strategic work has some strengths in it, but it has many weaknesses. And there's no time to go into all of those now, but it's terribly important for the council, I think, not just to go through the usual strategic outline of issues and sectors such as tourism, economic, social development, housing and so on, but to prioritise what it really needs to do in a hierarchy of needs and to outline a series of, instead of general statements that can be interpreted all sorts of ways by developers and by other people, that outline in very clear and very specific detail what has to be done to mandate the kind of outcomes they want, to develop quantified statements, not just wishy-washy outline of what would be nice, balancing all sorts of contradictory needs, but being very specific, quantifying those outcomes, allow them to be measured, so they have to be measurable and enforced. And the Ballarat planning strategy, I don't think does that. And I don't think it creates a hierarchy of what is needed. So I think if the council is under great pressure, it really needs to be doing, in my view, two things. And Daniel has hinted at these. In fact, he stressed one of them, and that is the need for council to identify land supply. If a council doesn't identify the areas that people are going to be able to live in the future, it's going to be overwhelmed by the kind of pressures Daniel's talked about. But simply rezoning land on the fringes of towns, metropolitan centres and huge metropolitan areas like Melbourne is no answer. It's the easy way. Developers love it. Landowners love it. If you own land and you have it rezoned, you make a lot of money. They love it. Developers love it because they have a business model that rolls out standardised housing. And when you go around Victoria, you see on the outskirts of towns all over the place, from Benalla to Warrigal, Ballaarat. I mean, it's amazing. All these townships are developing suburbs, mini suburbs that are growing into quite large suburbs in the case of Ballarat, that are replicas of what is failing in Melbourne. That is standardised housing products. In Melbourne, we're building whole suburbs where the house covers 80% of the block. There is no backyard. All this stuff about COVID that wants people to want to get out into suburbs again so that they can have room to play cricket and football with their kids. Well, it's not in Melbourne. And increasingly, it's not the kind of business model that is being developed in country areas, including Ballarat West. So certainly we have to make available land, but there are other ways to do it than simply taking the easy option of rezoning land on urban fringes and just putting standardised housing products. The council strategy itself, and Daniel in his public statements, I totally applaud. We need greater housing diversity. We need different housing products for different people of different ages and needs. But we're not going to get that if developers are allowed to roll out their standardised products. It suits them. They have a business model. It's always worked for them, and they don't like to change it. I think the other challenge is to ensure that there is sufficient infill. Now, this is a vexed question, because if council and the citizens of Ballarat are not very careful, redeveloping and infilling areas, that is, building houses within the existing metropolitan built-up area of Ballarat, that's not done very carefully, you're going to lose the other major attraction, in fact the key attraction of Ballarat, which is its heritage. So there are two critical objectives that I think council has to meet. It has to meet land supply, and it has to find a way to do that, but it has to retain the heritage of Ballarat. Ballarat's heritage is its most important economic asset. It's not just a cultural asset. It's not just an identity asset. It doesn't just make us feel better. It's critical for the future of Ballaarat's economy. People come to places that have high amenity value. They come to places they like to be. They're like me. When I come to Ballarat, my wife and I walk around Ballarat. We look at what's happening. We want to participate in it. Ballarat's tourism is critically related to its integrity as a place of great cultural heritage. And if that is lost, Ballarat is not going to succeed. It will just degenerate into another township and lose its vital point of difference. Now, I don't think the council strategy emphasises this enough by any means. When you look at the council strategy, it places heritage, it gives very little emphasis to heritage. It's a couple of pages and it's a subheading. It's not up with tourism, it's not up with housing, dwelling supply, it's not up with economic development. It's a subheading under the sustainability heading. Heritage has to be plucked out of that mindset and given priority. There has to be a hierarchy, and Ballarat's heritage and its preservation has to be given top priority for all those reasons, for its economic value, for its importance as a point of difference, for its value as in the cultural identity of the people of Ballarat, such as yourselves. And comments like, we need to integrate heritage conservation with sustainable social and economic development, don't cut it with me. That is not good enough. The heritage has to be plucked out of that mindset and given top priority. What can be done about land supply? Because I think Daniel is absolutely right. Without making available the land, then there are going to be all sorts of problems. And again, I don't see in the council planning the fine-grained identification of the different housing types that are needed for different areas of Ballarat. I was part of a big study of Bendigo, Ballaarat, Kyneton and other townships a few years ago, and for Bendigo we identified 5 different housing types: apartment construction, low-rise apartment construction in suitable places, townhouse construction, dual occupancy houses in backyards, and infill on vacant land all around the place. And what we found was there's vacant land everywhere in Victorian townships, and there's a huge amount of land in Ballarat that is able to be redeveloped. It's not just the sites that have been identified, there's land all over the place. But identifying that land for the type of housing product that is needed, whether it should be a 2-bedroom attached row house of the type you see in Fitzroy, that you see everywhere in Collingwood, Fitzroy and Carlton and so on, or should it be a townhouse, a double-storey townhouse, attached again? What should go on those sites, or should it be a house in a backyard? This takes planning. It takes looking at needs. It really requires the council to go right across the municipality and identify what can be put where, and ensuring always that the heritage of Ballarat is protected, because all development should be in keeping with that protection objective. So, to finish up in the next couple of minutes on the actual techniques, that's the strategy. The council planning scheme is an absolutely critical part of this. And again, the council planning scheme doesn't provide, in my view, the sufficient protection the council needs. For example, there's about a 60-40 split at the moment between housing in the greenfield areas, 60% roughly in the last year or so, 40% in the infill areas. That's a bit of a misleading figure, because some of the greenfield land is actually classed as infill land, so it's actually less than that. But there's very little development occurring in the CBD, unlike, for example, Bendigo, where it's starting to increase. Now, the obvious clash is that if this isn't done incredibly carefully, you will lose the values of the CBD. You'll have all sorts of incongruous buildings. And at the moment, there is insufficient planning protection for the CBD, and the tidal wave is coming. It's over the horizon, but it's on the way. And in Melbourne, for example, the commercial one zone and the other zones that exist with a heritage overlay that in general, with the exception of the CBD here, where there is a mandatory heritage overlay, but there's discretionary height controls or no height controls. And in Melbourne, we're watching, as we speak, every week, whole heritage areas just demolished for medium and high-rise development. Now, this will happen to Ballarat. Developers will move into these areas because they're close to where they will judge people want to live. So there has to be better protection for the heritage assets and values that are currently applying in Ballarat, or it will be overwhelmed. It will be slow initially, but it will be overwhelmed. If you look at Melbourne today, in 2000, there were very few residential high-rise buildings in Melbourne. Right? It's hard to believe. Almost none. And you go to Melbourne now, you come over the Westgate Bridge, you look at all that high-rise, it's not commercial, it's residential. And this happened overnight virtually. So there needs to be a review of the planning instruments to deliver a stronger strategy on heritage, ensuring, of course, that when land supply is provided, whether it's infill or outer urban development, is in keeping with the wonderful heritage assets. Finally, the outer urban areas again. I've just been involved in a big study of the outer urban suburbs of Melbourne, and look, they're terrible. They truly are terrible. World's worst development. And what we find is the council, it's critical that the council, there is going to be outer urban development, but it needs to be done in a completely different way. We found in this group that I've been involved in, did this study of every outer urban development in Melbourne. It took us 2 years. And we found most of the houses don't have solar orientation. Right? Sunlight doesn't come into the living areas. Basic things like that. And I bet this is happening in Ballarat. So the design of these suburbs has to provide greater mix of housing. It has to provide a different housing model. It needs to be much denser in parts, but it needs to be built around town centres where people can walk where they need to, or else we're going to end up with all these thousands of new people coming to Ballarat in poorly serviced areas, stuck out between 5 and 8 kilometres in Ballarat West, dependent on bus services that are going to be problematic, not able to walk anywhere, and we're going to replicate what is failing in Melbourne. And I really do believe Ballarat deserves much better because it is so important. It is part of a critical identification of Australia. I don't know of a more important heritage area than Ballarat, culturally and through its built form. So I do think Ballarat deserves the best that can be given it through proper planning.
Thank you very much, Professor Buxton. Certainly very thought-provoking. We're conscious that we started a little late and that we know that people have questions. So, different to what I said before, what I will ask you to do is just to stand up, say your name and say your question loudly, and we will get the two guest speakers to repeat the question at the mic so that everybody knows what the question is. So we're going to go to about 20 minutes, as we said, of questions. So there will be time, but I don't want any statements. It's just a question, right? No statements. A question to either of the guest speakers or both guest speakers. First one. There we go. Greta. Say it loudly.
sure if we're meant to be repeating back the question, at least anyway. So, especially for those who might not have been able to hear the question or watching online, the question was about climate change. So it obviously wasn't a topic that I focused on. I think I actually got cut off. I was being wound up in the end. I was talking too long, so sorry for that. You're right to ask the question. At one of our most recent council meetings, we unanimously moved a motion to strive toward Ballarat becoming a carbon neutral city by 2030. Now that's an ambitious but achievable target. We're even seeing many of our businesses, it's been used as an excuse in the past. It's not cost effective to business. It's rubbish. We have Mars and McCain's, for instance, a couple of our big employers and currently big consumers of energy, who are heading down that path themselves. Mars has got, if you drive around the Western Freeway, you'll see their massive solar farm, for instance. McCain's, that has that massive solar farm. From a council point of view, we've got a plan to work toward carbon neutrality by 2025 in our case. So sorry I haven't mentioned it in the actual speech I gave, but it doesn't detract from necessarily the importance of it. I guess I was trying to work more toward the topic of just growth. What else can I say on that? I think it's also important that our next suburbs are sustainable. And it's interesting that from a developer point of view, that they now see that as a point of difference and as a marketable thing to a future resident. That, again, having a sustainable house is not a bad thing. It's a selling point. It's a unique point of difference. And we are uniquely placed in Ballarat with our range of solar farms and wind farms around us to be far more renewable. We can be a renewable energy provider to a big part of Melbourne. So, yeah, look, I can only agree with your comments. Yep.
Thank you. Back, standing up.
I know it might be a question for you, Michael, I reckon. So the question, for those who might not have been able to hear, was a reference to money spent on consultation around Civic Hall, and I guess once that money's sunk, it's spent. But nevertheless, someone of Michael's expertise is always very welcome. Do you want to maybe come up and address that one, Michael, in terms of getting expert advice, perhaps, or something like that, and how councils can tap into that? I'd defer to your background, if that's right.
Thank you for that. I'm always looking for a quid. In my semi-retirement, I seem to be doing all sorts of work but I'm not getting paid. Look, I don't need to be paid for anything. I'm really happy to be working with Daniel and the council. This group, for example, that we've worked on the outer suburbs of Melbourne, we've produced two really major reports. We've consulted with government, the Victorian Planning Authority, all local councils. I mean, we've done this kind of work on outer urban development, and we want to. It's about to be reviewed, and it'll come out after our next discussion with the Victorian Planning Authority. We'll be giving it to the Ballarat Council. We're really looking for regional areas to work with us on that, and the VPA, the Victorian Planning Authority. So, yeah, there's no need for consulting. We're really happy to work. And the peri-urban work we've done, we've modelled all that as well. And we're really happy to come and work with the council. And in fact, I think it'll be wonderful because Ballarat is such a wonderful case study. So we're happy to do that at any time.
Thank you. David? David Berry. What's your name?
Might have to jump up here, Michael, and stay up here. Sorry, mate. I found myself, by the way, nodding in agreement pretty much everything Michael was saying. Everyone who was critical of various council reports. So you're very welcome, Michael. Over you, mate.
Sorry? yes, I think height, not just bulk and the type of housing, but height is an absolutely critical issue in urban form. I've spent years, either with groups or on my own, trying to convince ministers to bring in mandatory height controls in Melbourne, and I must admit that it's been a complete and utter flop. And I'm always amazed at the fact that ministers, planning ministers and other ministers get on a plane, they haven't been able to in the last year, but they get on a plane and they go to places like Vienna, Berlin, Paris, Prague, because they love those cities. They love their historic character and they revel in it. And yet they come back here and approve these monstrous high-rise which separate people from the street, which introduce windy, dark areas that nobody is on at night. I just worked with some people on a big community group in South Bank, and the amount of crime in South Bank in the night, in the evening, is extraordinary. People can't go on the streets. There's nobody on the streets, and it's just not a safe place because they're not street focused. So height is critical, and I do believe that Ballarat has to get mandatory design development overlays on the heritage overlay because there is some protection for the CBD, but without that mandatory height control, then the incentive is always going to be there for developers to bid up the price of land. So what's happened in Melbourne, without going into it, land price is bid up and the building price is bid up all the time by the developers who then keep building higher buildings in order to gain a return on the money that they outlay. So not having height controls is a way of raising land price and developers have to get their return. So yes, it's absolutely critical.
Daniel, do you want to...
Yeah, so I might even partly respond, but also maybe even pose a bit of a question to Michael and myself in that regard. It's something that we will, as a council, be struggling with in the couple of years ahead, is where we set our height limits, and there's some work about to kick off in that regard. I guess for me, the challenge really is that we have very much a philosophy or a mentality in Ballaarat where everything, especially as we grow out, is all about the 3 or 4 bedroom house with a block of land behind it, and that's not suitable to everyone. We have a complete lack of diversity of housing, especially if you are a single person. You can't necessarily afford $450 a week for a 4-bedroom house you're not going to need. If you're a person escaping a domestic violence situation, again, this is a cost you can't necessarily afford, and it's because we don't really have much diversity. If you don't believe me, just jump on one of the real estate websites and try to search for a rental. They're all 3, 4 bedrooms. So to sort of simply say that Ballarat has to be this model all the time, I think we've got to change that mentality a bit while respecting height limits as well to some degree and figure out what that sweet spot is where we can start to provide a mix of accommodation while also respecting the DNA of Ballarat, as Michael was saying, with the heritage. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but we'll be looking at experts like Michael for that, I think.
Next question, and just in the front here.
Exactly. Yep. So well said, Mary, and for those who might not be able to hear or online, the question was really in regard to, I'll summarise or paraphrase a bit for you, Mary, in terms of what could be done to increase the level of social housing, especially on some developments at 5%. I know developers will push back obviously strongly on it. It's a profitability imperative there, and there's nothing wrong with profitability. You don't get cities developing unless there's a return on investment. I understand that, but it also strikes at the heart of the city as well too, in terms of how you cater for those less fortunate. I understand our homeless level has increased considerably since COVID as well. Look, I agree, Mary, it's an area that's got to do better, basically, and try to set higher targets, especially as we expand greenfield areas. Michael was rightly pointing out that that's the cheap and easy and simple model from a development perspective. So I would have thought then that there's also with that the opportunity to increase the level of social housing, but it's not just about plonking social housing out in the outer suburbs where it's hard to get in. Ultimately, I think a greater mix of social housing and the right mix of room sizes, for instance, is necessary in the central areas where people sort of have some greater access to work and hospitality, retail, for instance, in particular, and also don't have that transport challenges. So if you, for instance, are needing a more affordable house, if you're escaping a domestic violence situation, then having a central house of an appropriate size that's affordable, I think, is critical. So, Mary, I can only agree. We've got to keep doing better in this space. Michael, you're probably better to talk on that. Do you want to add to it at all? Yeah, by all means.
Thanks, Daniel. A couple of years ago, I went on a property council tour of the west coast of the US to look at social housing and the housing products. And the first meeting, I remember we went with the property council representatives, and they were told by the experts on property that were telling them about the Californian way that nobody built high-rise housing, and they mandated 20% to 25% of social affordable housing in every development, 4-storey development. Most of these cities had a limit of 6-storey development, and they mandated 20 to 25% affordable housing in mainly 4-storey development. And the developers, the property council people said, hey, how do you make that work? And they said, well, you mean you don't do affordable social housing in your developments, particularly when you're building a 70-storey tower? I mean, how much money are they making without providing anything back to affordable housing? So it's got to be mandated, and the government just refuses to do it because the property industry runs the decision-making of the state. They're getting $10 billion a year from property-related taxes and charges. $10 billion, right? 48% of the Victorian state income comes from property-related sources. So it's really critical then for councils and to put the pressure on, and for people. If people don't pressure their local members, this isn't going to change. So that's where the pressure's got to come, I think. But it can be done.
Okay. At the back with a hat. A name?
Question is, to what extent can council intervene in the property market to achieve better climate change outcomes from the design and the construction process of housing to avoid high energy use and the heat island effect and so on? Once again, councils they really are stymied to a point by the state government standardised planning controls and building controls across the state, and councils really are bound to apply these. But within that general restriction, I still think councils can do an awful lot. For example, they can really put the pressure on developers, and they can refuse to approve developments that don't conform with the kind of principles that you're talking about. You know, and we were talking about them before, solar access to reduce the need for energy use during the day, and all those principles of good design. It's interesting that we have, 4 years ago, it's changed slightly now, but we had the highest average outer urban house size in the world. We're building huge houses, and for smaller populations of those houses, smaller numbers of people in the houses, it's just that everyone wants a big house. And of course, not everyone can afford a big house, but even the houses that aren't so big are not great energy users, because you can achieve the standard, the star rating for houses by getting double glazing and so on, without one beam of sunlight coming into the house. Now, that's not right. So I do think that there is an awful lot councils can do, but I guess they need to get their actions prioritised. They need to work out how they're going to do it and work with the development industry to get a different outcome.
Yeah, I think so. I probably don't have a huge amount to add to what Michael just said, really, other than I think you're actually also starting to see developers starting to head to that space as well too, in the sense that with changing public attitudes, then they can see it as being more marketable as well too. But I might throw to more questions.
I'm sure we'd have lots and lots more questions, and all these issues could go for forever, I guess. But I'm going to invite BMI board member Prue Bentley to move a vote of thanks to our speakers.
Yes, what a fascinating couple of speeches, and certainly some great questions from the audience. I'm sorry we can't keep going on all night. I'm sure you'd like to bend their ears very much more. This is the first in 4 instalments of the Ballarat Unmasked Getting to Know Your City Twilight Talks for 2021, and it's really wonderful to see such a great turnout for this one. I do hope that you'll join me next week for our second speech, which is about heritage. And we talked a little bit about that tonight, but we will be delving into it in a lot more detail with Wendy Jacobs, who is a heritage architect and a heritage consultant, and also Mike Whitehead, who I think, sneakily, I saw in the audience here somewhere, who many of you may have seen on Restoration Australia, and he renovated the wonderful Baptist Church on Dawson Street. So he will be talking us through that process, and you can ask questions as well on the night. So that's this time next Thursday. But of course, I must thank our guests tonight for giving up their Thursday night, coming and speaking to us and taking some curly questions. The Mayor, Councillor Daniel Maloney, thank you very much. And Professor Michael Buxton. We can't pay you, but we have got, I think it's payment enough. It's a beautiful Michael Unwin Wines that is local to this area. So please accept our thanks, and thank you so much. And thank you to you all. Please come to our next series. Thank you.
Coming home late from a night of drinking whiskey straight, on my knees saying, Lord above, please won't you give me relief? Sins that I'm praying for, the Lord ignores. He ain't got no cure. But here I am on my bed at 2 a.m. singing